your work has touched on many of the dominant topics that this organization discusses. You've written about human intelligence and the bell curve and its social significance, exceptional human achievements and human accomplishments, and now recently you've written on education. And thank you for being here.
It's my great pleasure. However, initially I was listed, I think, as the distinguished contributor interview, and I looked at that and I said, no, enthusiastic consumer interview maybe, but I have not added to the edifice of psychometrics that, with the kind of work that you folks are doing. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here.
Well, to just get us going, why don't you tell us a little bit about your academic history, your education?
It's very short and sweet. Grew up in Newton, Iowa, went to Newton Public High School, went from there to Harvard, graduated in 4 years with a BA in Russian history, which has been of completely no use to me since then. And after a 5-year interregnum when I was in Thailand, I went to MIT, finished the PhD there, and graduated in 1974. Concentrations there were quantitative methods and political development. The political development has also been of no use to me, but the quantitative methods were. But the degree itself is in political science. I have never done political science in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. A number of the distinguished interviewees that have visited us over the years have talked about their early experiences in the military and how that impressed them with respect to coming to terms with the diversity of the human condition. Now, you weren't in the military, but you were in the Peace Corps. And I just wonder how that influenced your worldview and your intellectual work.
Well, I essentially grew up in Thailand. I went there right after Harvard, spent the next 5 years there. So I spent from 22 to 27, which are extremely formative years, working in rural development in Thailand. I got married over there. I had a child over there. It had two kinds of effects, both very profound. One of those has to do with my political views. I am unlike, I think, the rest of the people in this room, is that I have a Jekyll and Hyde personality. I don't like to put it that way, but I do write on political topics, known in some circles as a right-wing ideologue, and I also do social science, and I think I managed to keep the two pretty separate. But my views on the way the world ought to work politically were profoundly influenced in Thailand, working in Thai villages, seeing the difference between the priorities that villagers had and the priorities that Bangkok had for the villagers. And I will not go into any more detail about it than that, since the topic of this is not my politics. But the other thing that happened during those 5 years was that I was working in Thai villages as a researcher after I left Peace Corps, and doing basically quasi-anthropological participant research in Thai villages. And I decided, after doing this for a while, that I had insights about the way Thai villages were that were superior to some of the anthropologists who wrote about Thai villages. And the only way I could demonstrate that was through the kind of narrative description that anthropology uses. And I had this strong feeling that's not good enough, that there ought to be ways to test the arguments you're making about Thai villages in ways that permitted comparison with other people's ideas. And so that's when I decided I wanted to learn quantitative methods, and that's when I ended up applying to go to MIT and taking every quantitative course that MIT had to offer, which is a lot. So Thailand, for me, was crucial in just about every aspect of my career.
That's interesting. Well, let's fast forward it to 15 years ago when the bell curve was published, and a little prior to that, actually. How did the bell curve come about?
It's all Linda Godfredson's fault. Linda, you're out there, right? Yes, indeed. Actually, you have to realize something, and I don't know if I've ever told this before. When I was collecting data on juvenile delinquents in Cook County in the 1970s to evaluate a program for dealing with chronic delinquents, I was doing data collection out at one of the correctional facilities, and they had on each of the cards of the kids who were in the correctional facility their score on a whisk, which had been administered to all of them. I didn't even write down the score. I was so convinced that IQ was a meaningless measure when it came to black and underprivileged kids. That sort of shows the distance I moved. Then thereafter, I did read bias and mental testing, which opened my eyes to some degree, but the real pivotal occasion came in, I think, 1986, when Linda Godfredson and Robert Gordon each sent me a paper that they were going to present at the American Psychological Association. And I think Robert's purported to explain the black-white difference in crime rates on the basis of IQ, and Linda's purported, if I remember correctly, to explain differences in unemployment, racial differences on the basis of IQ. And they wanted me to be a discussant at their panel at the APA. And I said, whoa. Do I really want to do this? And I read the papers. I saw the enormous scholarship that had gone into them, all this stuff that I had never known, really, even after reading bias and mental testing. I had no idea that this kind of information linking IQ to social outcomes was out there. And I got completely fascinated. And it preyed on my mind. And I finally decided, here's this fascinating stuff nobody's talking about for a general audience, and I decided I was going to do it. So in the fall of 1989, I was about prepared to make the leap when I saw an article written by Dick Herrnstein, published in The Atlantic, I think on the demography of IQ, fertility rates and so forth. And I thought, shoot, Herrnstein is in the process of writing this book himself, and I'm not going to compete with Dick Herrnstein, since he knows a little bit more about IQ than I did. And so I called up Dick, who I had met professionally, and told him that I was interested in doing this book, but if he was going to write it, I'd forget it. And Dick said on the phone, he said, no, I'm not writing that book. Let's do it together. And I thought, gee, that's really an interesting idea. And so I said, let me think, and I hung up the phone. And I think it was no more than an hour or two later, I called him back and said, let's do it. That was the sum total of our agreement. Oh, yes, we did say, okay, we'll split the royalties 50-50. And Dick said, can we go alphabetically on the authorship? because Dick and Jim Wilson had co-written Crime and Human Nature a few years earlier, and they had literally flipped a coin to decide the order of authorship, and Dick had lost. And so I said, yeah, we'll go alphabetically on authorship. That was the complete agreement between the two of us, and there we went.
That is interesting. Now, 15 years have passed since the publication of the bell curve. What has held up, and what hasn't, and what do we still need to know?
The answer I'm about to give would be disputed by any number of people who hate the bell curve, but in terms of the substance of the technical assertions in that book, everything has held up. And I'm thinking of the core chapters of the book, especially the first dozen of them, the first four about cognitive stratification, and then the next 6 or 7 on the relationship of IQ to a variety of outcomes. There was poverty, there was family formation, crime, 3 or 4 others. Dick and I never strayed outside the very center of the envelope in terms of the existing state of knowledge. We never pushed it at all. And this is one of the few audiences, I think, that can find that statement plausible. We really didn't. The numbers were there. They were quite clear. We never tried to go farther than they easily permitted us to go. And then on the data, on the presentation of race differences and the state of American education and the rest of it, I'm prepared to defend to this day virtually any of the assertions we made, and in many cases I think that they are stronger now than they were then. But in the last couple of chapters of the book, we did something which I think is appropriate for anybody who's doing social science and has a political perspective, which is 100% of the authors of social science. The difference is some people say it and other people don't. And Dick and I said it. We said, look, you can take the data we have presented and you can go either direction. You can take the data we presented and say this is a perfect justification for a redistributive welfare state to compensate for the inequalities that nature has conferred on people. Or you can have other interpretations, and we're going to give you another interpretation. And at that point, we made three statements about where we thought things were going. One is that we foresaw an increased stratification and isolation of the cognitive elite. Secondly, we said that we thought there would be an alliance formed between the affluent and the cognitive elite. And third, we said that there would be deterioration in the life conditions of people at the bottom of the cognitive ladder. And so if you ask me what didn't hold up, Dick and I were wrong. I am now convinced that the affluent and the cognitive elite would form an alliance. I think that we underestimated the degree of the political fault line that separates not smart people, but by cognitive elite, we didn't mean just people with IQs above a certain level. I guess we meant the kinds of things they talk about with symbolic workers. There are a variety of terms for them, the new class and so forth. We did not see that alliance. On the contrary, I think we are seeing divisions in American politics that reflect all the ways in which the schism has developed and grown in that area. So that we definitely got wrong. What's up for grabs? What's up for grabs are not some of the central things in the book, but they're things that, if you ask me, what are the things I most want to learn in the next half dozen years that I don't think I know enough about now? One has to do with ethnic differences. Will somebody please give me better data on East Asians? You know, Dick and I said that, well, taking all the different estimates together, probably East Asians are 3-4 points above the white European mean. And there's a lot of data out there, a lot of separate studies. There's nothing like the large representative samples of Chinese in China, for example, that I'd like to see. I'd really like to know a whole lot more about what's going on in India, where you've got lots of different populations. So there are a variety of ways in which I don't think we know. Not just do we know about nature versus nurture and ethnic differences, we still don't even know a lot about the ethnic differences, the magnitudes of the differences and where they exist and so forth. And the other thing that drives me crazy is the issue of elevating IQ, elevating cognitive function. And there seems to be a fairly clear pattern. And we stated in the bell curve, and there's been a lot of work since, and as far as I can tell, it's absolutely consistent. And that is, you know, you can get about 0.4, 0.5 standard deviations increase in an attempt to elevate cognitive functioning on the exit test, and that will diminish monotonically for the next couple of years to a point of insignificance. That seems to be what we continue to know. It's inconsistent with any reasonable estimates of the heritability of IQ. If there is a sufficiently large shared environmental cause of IQ, we ought to have been able to do better than we have in elevating IQ through a lot of the efforts that we've done. We haven't had that kind of success. Some of the largest, most recent efforts and the best ones to reproduce Abecedarian and others, they haven't done it. So what's going on? That's the big what's up for grabs as far as I'm concerned.
Your initial comment about sticking to the facts and what was known, I just recalled a memory. A number of people in this room were called after the bell curve by reporters and asked what they thought. And Doug Detterman is here in the front row. I think I'm getting this right. A reporter called him and he said, I'm 100 pages into the bell curve and I haven't learned anything new yet. Did you tell that to someone, Doug? That's what I recall.
I heard that and I loved it. That was exactly what we intended.
What are your views on the Venezuela project? A number of people that I talked with in preparing this interview asked about that. Why don't you mention it?
I understand that you did get that reaction. Why didn't we talk about the Venezuela project? There are 450 words on the Venezuela project in the bell curve, but the word Venezuela is not in the index. So some of you who said we didn't talk about the Venezuela did not read the book from cover to cover. The Venezuela project was an attempt to elevate IQ in the nation, and it happened in the late 1970s, and Dick Herrnstein was part of the program designer. And the exit test there showed on one of their tests an elevation of, guess what, 0.4 standard deviations. There was no follow-up to that. And so you had an outcome which was exactly consistent with other attempts to intervene of that kind. And you can either assume that it uniquely among all the such interventions, it would not have shown fade out had we re-examined it, or you can say this looks like part and parcel of what we know already.
Okay, and just for the record, people outside this room were consulted in preparing for this interview, and no one here asked about that.
You all did read about it.
That's right. You know, as you've shown in the book and by drawing on the literature, intelligence is certainly important, psychological variable. How important is it in political science and economics now, 15 years after?
It's absolutely central, except it's always called educational attainment. Educational attainment has been figuring extremely largely in all kinds of economic and sociological studies, but it is the construct that dare not speak its name. Because people simply will not confront the fact that educational attainment is statistically highly correlated with cognitive ability, and that it just may be the cognitive ability that's responsible for some of the relationships with social outcomes rather than the education itself. I have found this is not a diffidence that confines itself to any one part of the population of people who deal in public policy. People who deal in public policy on the right are every bit as scared of IQ as people on the left, if not more so. Well, they couldn't be more so. They are as scared, and I keep thinking this is bound to end real soon. By real soon, I mean within the next decade, as the neuroscientists and the geneticists are going to unravel this story relatively rapidly. And once that happens, I have a feeling there will be a deluge of directly dealing with cognitive ability as a variable distinct from education in sociology and political science. You're seeing the signs of that when the journal, was it one of the major sociology journals, had an entire issue devoted to genetics, where sociologists are finally admitting they've got to come to grips with genetic considerations if they're going to continue to be relevant. And I think that evolution is going to proceed very rapidly.
Are they to the point where they appreciate the power of your sibling control piece?
Thank you very much for noticing that one. He's referring to a piece I did which takes advantage of all the siblings that are in the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, and simply looking at things such as earnings and the rest of it by sibling pairs who happen to vary on IQ. The people who have seen that say, gee, that's really powerful. But the fact is that that is not seen by very many people. The ability of social scientists not to look at things they don't want to look at is really stunning.
It is interesting in developmental psychology, for example, how siblings aren't studied very much. And in terms of the outcome, it's always parent and one child, or typically the mother. But yeah, after the publication of the bell curve, I think the Wall Street Journal was shocked by an editorial Linda Gottfriedson wrote, and how many academics signed it. I know it was widely circulated in the academy. It Xeroxed nicely onto one page, but you didn't hear much about it. What influence did that have, if any?
It was pure balm in the Murray household to see that in the Wall Street Journal, which it didn't even mention the bell curve. It simply said, here's the state of knowledge that people who are familiar with this discipline don't really argue about very much. And it went down through a series of points, almost all of which were ones that we'd made in the bell curve, 52 authors. And it was helpful. You know, it was helpful. Not only it made me feel great, but it also, I would have people mention that to me a lot, especially people who are not themselves experts, who would read the bell curve and say, gee, you know, this sounds temperate and measured and all that. But then all these people are saying it's racist pseudoscience. How do we, you know, we kind of like it, but how can we have faith that it's telling the truth? And that editorial gave lay people a reason to say, yeah, these folks, Herrnstein and Murray, aren't very far out in left field after all.
Okay, moving on from the bell curve now to another tome that you spent 5 years of your life working on, and I understand these weren't 40-hour work weeks either. Human Accomplishments. What motivated that volume after you had done something like the bell curve?
I doubt if many of you have seen Human Accomplishment. The subtitle is The Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950. And it's just a lot of data, lots and lots of data. It seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, I had read The Discoverers, a book by Daniel Boorstin back in the mid-1980s, and I went out and bought it in hardback, which I hardly ever do, because I was so excited at the idea of seeing a survey of the terrain of people who'd made great contributions to the development of knowledge. And it was really just a series of mini biographies. It was good, but it wasn't what I wanted. And then about, after the bell curve was over, it was about 1996, I was looking for my next big project, and a friend of mine was on the phone with me, and he said, well, you know, it's been a couple hundred years since The Wealth of Nations. Why don't you revisit The Wealth of Nations from the perspective of the late 20th century? And that didn't appeal to me, but it sprang into my mind right there in the phone conversation. The full title of The Wealth of Nations is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And suddenly I thought, an inquiry into the nature and causes of human accomplishment. What a great idea for a book. And so I started on it. I'm glad I did it, now that it's all over, but gee whiz, it was an incredible amount of work.
I'm glad you did it too. That was a fantastic piece of work. I remember though, toward the end of your book, you argued that truly great human accomplishments are actually on the decline. And that seems counterintuitive with respect to the sciences. And, you know, with respect to the arts, as right? You're falling victim here to the good old days type of...
Yeah, that chapter was the penultimate chapter, and it approached this quantitatively. Human Accomplishment is an intensely quantitative book. It uses well-established historiometric techniques to make indexes both for individuals and for individual achievements. So I wasn't just eyeballing it when I said accomplishment is declining. If you take rates of accomplishment by these quantitative measures, they have been declining, and I stop at 1850. So we're talking about declines actually that go back, in some cases, a couple of centuries. In the case of science, it all depends on how you define the accomplishment. If you are saying, how about the effects of the application of science on our lives, there is no decline. If, however, you put it in terms of the acquisition of new knowledge, not only is there a decline, and by the way, this argument is not original with me. There are a couple of important books that have been written on it in the last 10 years, antedating mine. But if you look at it in terms of the acquisition of new knowledge, every scientific discipline, sooner or later, is bounded. I mean, in the discipline known as the geography of the Earth, that's, you know, that map is pretty well filled in. That body of knowledge is pretty well known. In the discipline known as human anatomy, there's not much new to be found. And other disciplines are only different from that in degree, not in kind, including physics. And so there are all sorts of things that just cannot be discovered again. And if you look at genetics, which is going to have such incredibly profound future effects that we can only guess at, it's not going to be because they have discovered that something besides DNA is at work with human reproduction. A lot of the knowledge about genetics is already in hand, and we're just getting much better at applications. In the case of the arts, I think it's more profound than that. A couple of quick comments on the technical aspects of it. If you take a rate of production of great literature, you know, great works per 100,000 people or whatever, there are all sorts of things that spring to mind as to why that might not be a good measure. I will simply tell you, and invite you to read the book to see if you agree, that almost all of the artifacts that are introduced by using a rate artificially make the recent past look better than it really is. There's a thing called epicentrism, which is that we systematically overweight things that are happening recently at work there. And there's also simply the de facto population that's available to do great artistic work. I mean, the fact is that throughout human history, all of the people who had the small motor skills and the visual spatial skills of Michelangelo, only a fraction of those people have ever been in a position where they had the slightest opportunity of expressing those skills because they were subsistence farmers someplace. And so if you take a look at the de facto populations where we have a chance for people with talent to express themselves, we're much better off now than we were before. And I would argue that even stopping in 1950, there was a real decline in the rate of production of great works of literature and visual art and music. Since 1950, which was not part of my book, let me put it to you as a challenge. And when we get to questions from the audience, you can all tell me why I'm wrong. Name for me a work of visual art or a piece of music or a book that will still be as much a part of life, cultural life, 200 years from now, as Vivaldi's Four Seasons or Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is today. You can go into any airport bookstore in the United States anyway, just about any airport bookstore, and you can find Dickens and Austen and Thackeray and so forth on sale in an airport bookstore. Tell me, in an airport bookstore 200 years from now, what novels written from 1950 to the present are still going to be for sale there. I have an argument that I make in Human Accomplishment as to why we are so impoverished when it comes to great work in recent years, but I won't bore you with that now. It's a long story.
Mickey Mouse, you will find Mickey Mouse.
Because we're primarily psychologists in this audience. I'm just curious, given the volumes, how you distilled each discipline to one page, and then I mean, it was really humbling to see that there were probably 6 people in every discipline that were the prime movers, and everyone else were worker bees. What did you learn about the psychological attributes of the exceptional achievers that surprised you? What did you...
Well, David, part of it was not that much of a surprise, but I was glad to see that science vindicates what my own impression has been, which is that the people who are great achievers in every field work like crazy. There is no such thing as the great artist who just pass it off, and I include Mozart in that. I mean, who has that reputation of effortlessly writing down the words in his head. You read Mozart talk about the creative process, and it was hard for him too. But just the enormous amount of work that goes on. However, I will add to that the big surprise is something you just alluded to. This historiometric method that I'm talking about, here's what you do in effect. I'm simplifying, but basically this is it. Suppose I'm interested in great composers. I go out and I get a comprehensive history of music. I go to the index and I write down the number of pages devoted to each one. And then I do that with a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one, and go up, in my case, I think I was up to 16 or 17 comprehensive histories of music that create the index. The reliabilities of those indexes are at the 0.98 level. They're incredibly reliable. You can also demonstrate that the writers of these histories aren't copying from each other. There are lots of ways to demonstrate these are independent experts representing it. And they also come out with a lot of face-valid rankings. I mean, there is a tie at the top of the music index, Mozart and Beethoven. That's pretty face-valid. But what really astonished me was this. My index scores were on a 100-point scale, and there is no technical reason why those numbers should be of any particular distribution. There's nothing forcing them into a normal distribution or a rectangular distribution or anything else. As I started to look at those scores, it really bothered me because with by the way, by definition, the top-ranked person in each field had a score of 100, and the other scores are relative to that. It really bothered me because I did not have, 4 or 5 scores in the 90s and 8 or 10 scores in the 80s and 20 scores in the 70s. I had 1 or 2 scores in the 90s at most, and then maybe the next score might be 81, and the next one after that might be 74, and then 50, and I'm saying, these curves are crazy, because they're just going like that. It turns out that a guy named Alfred Lotka established that a century ago when he looked at the number of published writings in chemical journals, and it turned out the most common number of published writings by PhDs in chemistry was 1, and the next most common was 2 in a shape like that, and the number who had 10 or 20, just an incredibly small number of people out there. Well, okay, so that's true of publishing articles in technical journals. Is it just the case that it's an artifact of people giving their opinions about Mozart and Beethoven, that they devote all this time to them and not so much time to Dürer or whatever? And so what I actually thought was a pretty bright idea, I said, what about fields in which there is an objective measure of excellence? And I used golf. And a measure of excellence is, I used 2 kinds. One was components of skill in golf, such as putts per round and length of drives, because the PGA keeps wonderful statistics in all of these things. The length of drives and all the rest of that. Each one of those component skills forms bell curves, even among professionals, okay? But if you go as a measure of success winning of tournaments, or if you have an even tougher measure of great achievement, the winning of major tournaments, like that. So you have all these people who win 1 tournament and a few more who win 2. The number who win more than 5 or 6 are down to very few. And then way out here at the tail is Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus, and that's it. So my proposition is, sorry for such a long answer, but I find this very interesting stuff. My proposition is, if when you have objective measures, And I used tennis and golf and chess and other things as well, winning of marathons. If they all show Latka curves, and if achievement in the arts and sciences also shows Latka curves, the parsimonious assumption is they're both tapping into the same thing, which is real genius, real greatness is real rare.
Okay, and now we go from that lofty ambition to the educational system. And you've recently published a book on real education. How did that come about?
Do you realize how gratifying it is to be asked how the things you do come about? Because nobody's ever interested in that stuff, but to you it's very interesting. In the case of real education, I got a call from the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page just after Christmas 3 years ago, I guess. And he said, is there anything you want to write about for the op-ed page? And there wasn't anything that I wanted to write about except one thing, which I wanted to bash No Child Left Behind. For those of you not from the United States, No Child Left Behind is a very ambitious program jointly sponsored by Ted Kennedy and George W. Bush, proving, in my view, the idiocy of the major politicians of both parties, that was going to transform the American educational system, making every child above average. I'm quite serious. I'm quite serious. It had as its legislative goal by 2014 to have all children scoring at proficient and above, whereas the level of proficient on the tests that they were using is something that only about 26% of the school children in the United States were currently at. So anyway, it was a terrible program. It caused terrible damage to America's public schools. I wanted to bash that, and I said, okay, the problem is that there's no real news hook for this story, which is the phrase for an op-ed piece, you need a news hook. But I realized there was so much energy, so much anger that I had about that program that I never work after dinner, never ever work after dinner. And I went back to my office that night, and in about 3 hours, I had sketched out a series of 3 pieces for the Wall Street Journal. And I said to the guy, I said, you know, I have something I want to write, but it's going to take 3 pieces. And he said, okay. And they ran them sequentially, 3 days in a row, which they'd never done. And then somebody called up and said, why don't you make that into a book? So I did. That's how that happened.
Interesting. Now, what would you say to a critic, maybe someone like Howard Gardner, who says that, well, you focused a little too much on data from the U.S., and what if you would have taken a good hard look at places like Finland or Singapore, East Asia, teachers who put an emphasis on high expectations, accountability? Might you have found something different? What would your response be?
And I think David is referring there to the first couple of chapters of the book. The first chapter is entitled Ability Varies. I wanted to make my propositions real simple. And the second chapter was half of the children are below average, which, by the way, I have gotten hissed for saying at college campuses on occasion. And so I was saying that, in effect, that the limits on ability to learn are quite strict. If you're talking about what Howard calls logical mathematical skill and linguistic ability. But it's also true with kinesthetic intelligence, with each of Howard's 7 abilities, which, by the way, I used as my framework for discussing this, that there are sharp constraints on how much anybody can learn who is of average or below, and this should not surprise us. All right, in that context then, I guess the question is, well, what about Finland, what about Singapore, where kids knock the top off of the international tests compared to the US? And my response to that is real simple. Let us take a sample of United States children and a sample of Singaporean children and one of Finnish children and Swedish children and all the rest at age 6. Let's administer a standard IQ test. Give me those scores, And then let's, at that point, compare the results for educational attainment in 6th grade, 7th grade, or whatever. And I will make two hypotheses, state two hypotheses. One is that for students tested at age 6 who are in the top decile of IQ, they will have done much worse than kids from Singapore and other school systems, because the United States does a terrible job of educating its gifted children. But for students in the lower half of the distribution, I will predict that, that matched for IQ, the United States does about the same as any other country. And that what we are seeing as a difference in the educational system in the United States reflects a difference in the kids going into those systems in different countries.
How have you treated non-intellectual personal attributes in your thinking about educational attainment? Is it fair to say that you've neglected them, as some critics suggest?
You give me good quantitative measures of industriousness and persistence and integrity, and I will use them. But we don't have those kinds of measures. We all know they're important, but it's impossible to do more than say they're important. After the bell curve came out, an engineer who was a prominent engineer on the Apollo moon landing program that I'd gotten to know when my wife and I did a book on that topic many years ago, was talking to me, and he said, "Charles, you know, you're really hung up on IQ." He said, "Look at me." He said, "I was a C student in high school and got to college and got interested in engineering and did great, and it's all a matter of motivation." And I said, "Jerry, that's very interesting." I said, "By the way, did you ever have an IQ test administered when you were in school?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "What was it?" And he said, 146. And I said, "Jerry, motivation is real important, you know, when you're starting with an IQ of 146. I think the best way to think about IQ, and the reason why IQ is different from industriousness and persistence, is captured by this wonderful analogy that was originated by Goldberg, Stephen Goldberg at NYU, where he says, and I'm sorry if people in the audience who are not familiar with American football, he said that IQ is to achievement in people as weight is to achievement in offensive tackles in the NFL. Which is to say, if you took all the offensive tackles in the NFL, these are the guys who are on the line, the great big guys who clear the way for the runner. He said, if you took a good measure of productivity for offensive tackles in the NFL and correlated that with weight, the correlation would probably be 0. But you have to weigh 300 pounds to begin with. And that's, with me, IQ, that industriousness is real important at all levels of life, for everybody. But if you want to be a theoretical physicist, you better weigh 300 pounds in an IQ sense before you make that your life's work. And so it is an all-purpose raw material to which you add these other incredibly important things, which we don't know how to measure very well.
The Nobel laureate James Hackman, the economist, has proposed an economic solution with childhood intervention for our educational systems. What's your reaction to his work?
This is going on the internet, right? So I can't say, what has he been smoking? Richard Nisbett also is, just as much as Jim Heckman, said, look, you know, IQ is very plastic. We can do this. And they've been citing as evidence sort of the same suspects. Milwaukee Project, Abecedarian, Perry Preschool, some assessments of Head Start and so forth. And for those of you in the room who have followed that literature and are familiar with the attendant difficulties, technical difficulties of interpreting those, and who are also familiar with the results of the later follow-ups of those, I guess, James Heckman is an extremely sophisticated economist, and so when he uses those results and says, well, there is a net economic benefit if you manage to apply these very intensive interventions across the board, then I don't doubt his mathematics. The idea of trying to franchise Perry Preschool, these incredibly intensive with high-quality case staff across the nation, is just crazy. But the real thing that I don't understand with either Heckman or Nisbet or anybody else is, we replicated Abecedarian, we meaning the country. It's called the Infant Health Development Project. It was a direct replication of the Abecedarian intensive infant method. It was using low birth weight babies as its sample. We were talking sample sizes in the hundreds, not like Abecedarian in the dozens, or like Perry Preschool in the dozens. So we're talking, not just that, it was well executed in several sites. It was well evaluated. We do have, in a sense that we do not have for these other projects, genuine, legitimate random assignment to control and experimental groups. We have follow-ups. It was a beautifully done piece of social science research. And at the end of it all, we now have the 17-year follow-up. If you take the sample of kids who went into that and compare the experimental and control groups, you've got nothing. Now, oddly enough, that isn't the way it was presented in the final journal article for the report. Instead, you never see the results for the entire sample. You see two different tables. One is for what's called very low birth weight babies, and the other who between that level, is it 2,000 grams or 2,100 grams, and the 2,500 grams, which defines low birth weight. Well, that's an ex post facto division in the following sense. They deliberately, they knew when they drew the sample that they were stratifying along that basis, devoting 2/3 of the effort to the very low birth weight babies, because that was their main interest. That's where they thought they were going to get the bang for the buck. But they also wanted babies that were less severely deprived in terms of weight. Well, it turns out that there is a statistically significant, though not substantively large, advantage for the babies who are not very low birth weight in comparison to the control group. There is, for the very low birth weight babies, somewhat of a disadvantage, not quite reaching statistical significance. But of course, since the very low birth weight babies were twice as many as the other ones, you add them all together and you've got no effect. In any rational world, this well-executed, large attempt to replicate Abecedarian would be treated as close to definitive, saying we really don't know how, with the current state of the art, to do much with interventions. Instead, I'm discovering, as I raise Infant Health Development Project, that a great many times the people I'm talking to have never heard of it, but they have heard of Abecedarian. Go figure.
You've had so much experience writing about controversial topics, and I know in the audience, ranging from graduate students to tenured faculty, people would be interested in your advice on writing about controversial topics, and whether or not it varies for graduate students all the way up to tenured faculty.
I'm laughing because I could easily ruin any number of people's lives by giving the wrong answer. Look, the first point is that you do not have to make a choice between writing about these topics and sacrificing your devotion to the truth. You can write about almost anything as long as you write it obscurely enough and publish it in... and the great example of that was David Rowe, who we lost so untimely, and who was such a fine scholar. He wrote a piece, was it American Psychologist? It was one of the major psychological magazines, on the architecture of the black-white difference And it was an incredibly powerful argument that what you were looking at was not the result of environmental differences. It was an elegant piece of work. It was also very difficult and very sophisticated. And David did not go out of his way to make it real obvious as to what he was saying. And it got no flack whatsoever, as far as I can tell. And you know what? I think that's okay, because the fact is that if you decide you're going to write for a general audience and you are on some of these taboo topics, you had better be the right personality type. Mm-hmm. You know, as far as I can tell, Arthur Jensen has just had such great equanimity that it never touched him, despite all the terrible things. As far as I can tell, Phil Rushton just has a great time with the whole thing, and thoroughly enjoys the fight. I think probably I was clinically depressed for about 6 months after the bell curve came out,
Really?
and all this reaction. I hated it, and in fact, it is no fun. And you are also, by the way, particularly those of you in academia, and Helmut can tell us about this, you are going to take serious hits if you stray into these areas and do it in a way which becomes known to the public at large. That is just a fact of life. It is a sad commentary, at least about the United States, that I work for a think tank called the American Enterprise Institute, that is known correctly so as being a free market think tank on the right side of the spectrum. After the bell curve, and before the bell curve came out, and knowing that conservatives are no more happy than liberals with talking about ethnic differences or any of the rest of this, I was quite nervous, because I could imagine the Board of Trustees sort of saying, why are we, this isn't about policy, you know, why are we supporting this guy, because this is not really the thing that the organization is about. On the contrary, that organization was proud of the work, never flinched, never was apologetic. I have utter academic freedom at a conservative think tank to do whatever I damn well please. And if I had been teaching at a major university, my dinner party invitations would have gone way down among my colleagues real fast, and a lot of friends would have frozen me out. I would have had, I wouldn't have my tenure taken away, although they tried to do that with Linda Godfredson, probably, but I would have found myself sort of in the back burner with all kinds of other faculty committees and so forth. I am reciting not what I think would happen, I'm reciting what did happen to Dick Herrnstein after IQ and the Meritocracy in the early 70s. So if you do this stuff and you're in a university, these bastions of intellectual freedom, you're going to pay a price. And you ought to know that going in.
Charles, as you reflect on your career, what's your biggest professional regret?
I knew this question was coming, and so I thought about it. Do I regret some of the flack from the bell curve? Sure. But you know, I've had a wonderfully fortunate career from the word go, and so I have an ambition, which is, you know, to keep writing and not sound stupid. As you get older, you know, you wonder at what point are you going to start doing things and you don't realize it yourself, but you aren't up to snuff. But fortunately, my wife edits absolutely everything I do, and she says at some point she's going to edit it and tell me it's wonderful and just never send it off anywhere. And we can avoid that problem that way. But professional regrets, no, not really.
John Maynard Smith asked his research group to tell him when he reaches that point, and one of his postdocs said it took place about 2 years ago. So, I think he was trying to be funny, but what achievement are you most proud of?
I do have an answer for that one. With human accomplishment, I'd written all the descriptive chapters And I was about 4 years into the work, and there's supposed to be a final set of chapters where I explain everything, and try to make it all hang together in terms of a coherent explanation. And I didn't have any. Not only did I not have any, I sort of was despairing that I was going to come up with any. And I was trying to say to my wife that, gee, this is a really interesting description, the way it stands. Maybe we can just publish it this way. But she said, no, you really ought to have something which tries to interpret all this. And there was about a 7-month period that followed, which was the most intense intellectual effort of my life. Bell curve didn't even come close. When I was grappling with this, and I ended up not with an explanation I think I concocted. I'm quite pleased with it. I think it hangs together, but it was intense to the point of being painful, and it was also something that when I started out on it, I didn't know how that story was going to come out. With the Bell Curve, or for that matter with Losing Ground, or these other books, actually once the blueprint was in place as to what the topics were going to be and so forth, the books wrote themselves, and when the interpretive issues were discrete. They lent themselves to discrete treatment. Trying to talk about, well, why is it that great works occur in a certain time and place? I'm not the first scholar to have attacked this question, and I did have some things I could read for homework, but coming up with the interpretation which satisfied me was really tough, and I was really happy when it was over with.
And finally, what are your current ambitions?
I already gave you the one, which is not to sound stupid. There's a book in the works. It's called Coming Apart at the Seams, and the subtitle is White America 1963 to 2008, because I have now figured out a way to avoid being called a racist. I'm just going to talk about non-Hispanic whites. And the reason I'm going to do that is that I think all sorts of interesting things are happening in the United States in terms of the development of a class structure. But if you talk about them in terms of the entire population, then you got to deal with all the questions about, what you're really looking at are differences between blacks and Hispanics and whites, and et cetera, et cetera. It is so clean to have a sample of non-Hispanic whites. It just makes the whole interpretive process easier. It makes it clarifies all kinds of issues. And so that's very much in the works right now. I'm working on it up in the hotel room and during the interim sessions and at this conference. It's really, really interesting, and will be done in a couple of years, I hope, and that's the current ambition.
Okay, well, this has been very enjoyable, and I think at this point what I would like to do is turn it over to the audience for their questions. So maybe, and to speed things up so we can get multiple
people too long.
Well, don't worry, they're interested. I'll just have you repeat the question.
Sure.
It'll go faster. Let's begin. Phil?
Okay.
Obviously, you work extremely hard. I was surprised to hear you didn't work in the evening. So could you tell us what your work schedule is like? What do you do when you get up in the morning, over breakfast? Just start the day of work.
Okay, what's my typical work day? And it's almost ritualized. It's like a kabuki dance at this point. I get up at about 6:15, go down, make the coffee, empty the dishwasher. My wife and I have an agreement. She washes the dishes, I empty the dishwasher. Neither one of us likes doing the other. Go out to my office, which is at home. So I just go out the backyard, and then after playing a game of chess and reading my email, I start to write. And I write until only about 10:30 or 11 if it's first draft. I can't write first draft any longer than that. I can edit, I can do data analysis, I can do data collection after 10:30 or 11, but at that point, if I've run into a difficult issue, I just say to myself, it's going to be a lot easier if I go after this tomorrow morning. And I continue that way until about 6 o'clock at night. I cannot tell a lie. I sometimes, in the afternoon, have at least 1 or 2 games of online poker on one screen while I'm doing some analysis in the other one. You can multitask that way. And at about 6 o'clock at night, 6:30, I go back into the house and have a martini, and that's the reason I don't work after dinner. It's not wise to do that after drinking a martini. That day just is basically the way I spend 6 days a week. And on Sunday, I have resolved that I will do nothing that actually involves the current scholarly work. I can do other things in the computer, but I can't do that.
What do you do in the evenings, socially?
My wife and I hang out together, and very companionably with. And we hardly. I live in Burkittsville, Maryland, which is a town of 170 people, and so it's not as if there's a real rich social life there. We stay home.
Other questions? Yes, James.
Well, I agree with you that there don't seem to be any Tolstoys or Chekhovs among us anymore. But I was wondering what your opinion was of the candidacy of Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez as a candidate for being in airport bookstores 20 years from now, or on Kindle or books or whatever they have.
Oh, I hate being exposed as a Philistine. I'm not familiar with it personally. It's one of these things I've heard the name of, and so if you tell me that it's really great, I have no basis for arguing with you. With most of the answers I get to that question, then I have heard them. The Beatles have been suggested any number of times, and so my stock answer is, "Are you serious?" But in your case, I can't say that to you.
Yeah.
When you were making your estimates about the malleability of IQ scores from Abecedarian and Perry, and concluding that it was whatever it is, 3 or 4 or 5 points in the short run, and then declines rapidly, it seems to me that that's not ultimately the quantity we're trying to estimate. It seems like the question on the table isn't, well, how much can we improve people's IQ by changing their world for a few hours a day and then putting them back at the end of the program into the old world that they were in and seeing what happens in the long run, like some kind of inoculation. The question, the ultimate question is what could happen if we change those kids? Again, impossible questions to answer, but maybe then we can look at the difference in the world between 1925 and the world now, where the world has completely changed. And what we see, again controversially, but somewhat less so, is that IQs have risen dramatically as the world has changed in a very complete way over that time. So, that's not much of a question, I know.
That's okay.
My question is, why do those special programs define what the potential is for changing IQ in a relative way?
And I'll repeat for the microphone, why do those experimental interventions constitute the point of interest when we ought to be looking at a broader sense of what if we could change the environment much more broadly construed? I agree with everything you said about adoption studies. I also agree with what you say about the historical nature of IQ. I'm not talking about the Flynn effect now. I'm talking about some work I did with the Woodcock-Johnson standardizations, only I did it on the basis of birth cohorts. And I think that there is a case to be made because there has been an argument about the black-white difference, has it been constant since we started IQ testing or not? If you go by the Army Alpha tests in World War I, you can say, that was about 1 standard deviation then, it's about 1 standard deviation now. I think a powerful case can be made that you have to throw those out as being inaccurate, and that in fact there was a major reduction in the black-white difference that occurred quite early. That it occurred among those who were born in the early part of the 20th century and grew up in the 1930s and 1940s, and that it was quite significant. It could have been as large as half a standard deviation, even though that's pretty speculative. So I'm not arguing with you on a lot of what you said, But let me offer a hypothesis, and I state it as a hypothesis, that when it comes to environmental effects on IQ, what you really need is a good enough environment, and that super-duper environments don't add much. You know, putting that mobile over the crib just doesn't have the effect people would like it to have, and that you take a look, suppose I'm right about the timing of that great big reduction in the black-white difference in the United States. It's not as if things were really great for blacks then, at all, and during the 1930s and 40s and so forth, but there was also a marked improvement over what there had been before, educationally and in other ways, and you got a big jump. I think that with environmental changes, again, I'm stating this speculatively, the environment is real important for development of IQ, but it facilitates sort of a rise to a plateau when it gets okay, and that augmenting it after that has much less effect than you think it would have. Trying to test that when you have the problems of race and so forth is very tough. I recognize the confound there, but that's sort of the attitude I take into it. Oh, one final statement though. The reason why I focus on those interventions, those experimental interventions, is people want to spend a lot of money on them, okay? A lot of money and a lot of resources, and they are doing it, in my view, on the basis of an unwillingness to confront a substantial body of data that tells a fairly consistent story, and I want to make that inconsistency known.
Would you consider enlisting in the sex war if Stephen Goldberg would sign up at the same time?
Would I consider enlisting in the sex war? Well, I might be stupid enough to write about race differences, but not stupid enough to write about... Actually, I did write an article called The Inequality Taboo in Commentary Magazine, which took on sex differences. But you know what? I think that one is going to... I'm very optimistic about that whole story. As the younger brother of two sisters and as the father of three daughters, the differences that exist now and that existed when my sisters was growing up is enormous. As the wife of a woman who came of age at the height of the feminist revolution in the early 1970s, I am also delighted by the ways in which she notes, as she looks at her friends who felt incredibly conflicted about the problems of having a career versus having children, and she looks at the next generation of women who are much more at ease with that, and see that they can have a career and they may want to interrupt that to have children. Maybe they'll have children, they'll continue the career. There's just simply much less angst. And I'm also gratified by all sorts of ways in which an awful lot of extremely high IQ women that I know, who are under absolutely no impression whatsoever that they are inferior intellectually to men, will say, well, of course men and women are different in terms of their cognitive repertoires. Duh, you know, that's obvious to them, and it is not threatening to them, as it should not be threatening to them. So I think that the sex wars are something that is going to die a natural death, and because everybody is becoming so much more adult about this once you move away from the faculty of Harvard University.
Away from Harvard.
Yeah.
I've seen some economists argue that while the early interventions don't necessarily have any effect on IQ or even achievement, they still want to maintain that they result in lower incarceration rates or higher employment, things like that.
I know, and a lot of the question was, forget IQ in terms of these early interventions, that they seem to have positive effects on things such as incarceration rates and employment. And I will say that it seems plausible to me that earlier interventions might be helpful in those regards. I say plausible. But the main evidence for that, again, comes from Perry Preschool. And I can't tell you the exact sample size, but you're talking about something like 40 in the experimental group and 60 in the control group. I'm not off by an order of magnitude there. I'm pretty close. And it's one of a whole bunch. It's a part of a library of data we have. Imagine what people would say about me if we had a library of information that said that early intervention helped lower incarceration rates. And I said, yes, but we have this study that was done in Perry Preschool with samples of 40 and 60 where it didn't lower them. You know, it would be nonsensical. And that's the same nature of the debate. People will take any attempt that has succeeded, and that trumps any amount of data that don't say what they want it to say. And I have watched that happen again and again, and it's a real blind spot among policy-oriented social scientists.
We have two questions. Why don't you go first, James?
I tremendously admire your work and the energy you put into it, but have you overestimated the rationality of the large audience? Are you in fact showing them things which are true, but which they will not accept for various tribal reasons? So you're still, I hope, with us in the rationalist ghetto. But outside there, they're using symbols which are very powerful to them, and your numbers don't add up as far as they're concerned, because the conclusions are unpalatable or just uncomfortable in some way. So is there a major issue for someone like yourself that you can be read by some, but not accepted by the many?
The question has to do with the, I write something, and the fact is that a lot of people are not going to either understand it correctly, or they aren't going to read it, or they're going to ignore it for reasons having nothing to do with rational appreciation of the argument or lack of it. I have an audience in mind when I write. I have a person in mind when I write. And this person is smart and doesn't agree with me, but is willing to give me a chance. And so my job as I write is not to lose that person, not to say something which will cause that person to say, oh, this is what I expected him to say, and throw it aside. And so I feel that I'm engaged in a dialogue with that person, and the most gratifying thing that happens to me is when people will come up and they will say, I read Losing Ground when I was an undergraduate, and it completely changed the way I thought about the world. And they will describe why, and they were reading it exactly as I wanted it. And the fact is that gratification, when you're in our line of work, doesn't really consist in counting in the millions. It consists of exactly that kind of reaction, which I guess is the same gratification as a teacher you get. When most of the kids don't get it, most of the kids are a pain, but you get some kids who understand what you tried to do. And so you may be right, but I don't worry about it.
So my question is about the SAT and ACT, getting down to the meat of many of your thoughts. In spite of the power of these ersatz IQ tests, they still do a pretty lousy job of predicting success in school or life. So what's your attitude about them in the political science sense?
The question is that the ACT and the SAT really don't do that great a job in predicting success in school or success in life. And then the last part was, so what do I think about the... Well, you've asked a complicated question. Point number one, I am in print in an article saying we ought to abolish the use of the SAT reasoning test, what used to be called the SAT verbal and the SAT math, because they have taken on way too much importance. And they have also sort of made it by people thinking, oh, they can go to coaching schools and for lucky kids and jack their scores up. They've contaminated that whole process. So on the one hand, I am happy to see the SAT not used, but I did want to substitute the SAT achievement tests in their place. So I'm in favor in terms, particularly for selection to demanding schools, to selective schools. If you're going to let kids into those schools, I think it's important to have good measures of how well they can be expected to deal with the material that those schools offer as their resource, and I'm happy to see measures of skill do it, even though I'm unhappy with the way the SAT has evolved over time politically in its use. The other thing I guess I'd say is, I know they don't explain a whole lot of the variance, but at the tails, but particularly at the upper tail, I bet if you put me in a room with students and I didn't know their SAT scores, I bet if I spent a couple of hours talking to them, I wouldn't do too bad in identifying the ones that scored over 700 on the verbal. And the reason I wouldn't do too bad, and all of you who teach, you can be better judges of this than I am, that when you look at very high scores in the SAT, you are looking at a level of potential to absorb information, which is worth knowing, and these are the kinds of kids that you want to be exposed to the most rigorous education they can get because they can absorb it. So that's a pretty incoherent answer to the question, but that's it.
Yeah, AJ.
What do you think of the recent series of books by Lynn and Van Hanen that seem to extend, it's an interpretation of course, but it seems to build on what you guys did in the bell curve and kind of globalize it and talk about this in a cross-national setting? I mean, given your experience in Thailand and with international affairs, how do you feel about that level of generalization?
The question was, what do I think of Lynn Van Hanen's attempt to internationalize a lot of these measures and so forth?
That's my representation, not theirs.
Okay. I wish that, speaking specifically of that book, I wish they'd just simply dumped a lot of countries that they didn't have good enough data for. I think that I'm much happier with the attempt in a paper which is being presented at this conference, be presented in a couple of days, where they use the international test scores, which seem to me to offer a lot more power in terms of interpretable data. So I'm not against the exercise at all. I do believe that that some countries, you do have different levels of human capital. I think there are other countries, and I'll go back to the case of India, where, boy, is that a complicated thing, and I'm sure you've got a patchwork quilt of all kinds of things going on there, where it probably is not useful to treat India as a single entity. So it's like any of the uses of IQ as a predictor variable for certain outcomes. This is going to sound very trite. You've got to specify what questions you are trying to answer of the data, and you don't want to make the data try to answer questions which you have good sort of theoretical a priori reasons for thinking it's going to be a weak answer. And so if you want to compare, look, you want to compare the countries of sub-Saharan Africa with Singapore and Japan and China. I think that the differences in IQ explain a significant part of that difference. If you want to compare Italy and Germany and Sweden now, I don't think that's going to buy you a lot because of the just much less power. But because of the IQ is a fairly blunt instrument. We have ways in which we've made it stronger and more sophisticated and all that. But the simple IQ score is useful, but it's a hammer as opposed to a scalpel. I've kept people from their alcohol for a long time, including me, I should add.
Well, this has been... I have a story to tell.
We all get it on.
Okay.
There's probably alcohol in the other room.
On that Roe article you mentioned, that was the action
There are
of it.
posters all around.
It